Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. So today, what I wanted to take a look at is I wanted to take a look at the other part of that Compromise of 1850 that really was a major part of the Compromise of 1850. And if you remember, it was one of the other things that favored the South and helped the South out a lot, which was that Fugitive Slave Law. And then we're going to take a look at a specific case where that Fugitive Slave Law was tried, and it's known as the Dred Scott case. So that's going to really put this new slave law to the test, and the Supreme Court is really kind of going to add to it a little bit and try to strengthen it so that the Fugitive Slave Law is tougher for African Americans that ran away to keep their freedom and stuff like that. So, if you remember in the Compromise of 1850, there were two things that made the compromise favorable to the South. It was the stronger fugitive slave law, and it was popular sovereignty. We talked about the popular sovereignty when we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Kansas-Nebraska crisis, and how the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were allowed to vote on whether they would prefer slavery or not prefer slavery. So that we realized was something that did not work, was very difficult at this time to have people vote on fairly, because this is an issue that is very important to everyone, and nobody is really going to see a way to compromise and really find a way to decide whether a state or a territory is going to be slave or free fairly. So popular sovereignty, we know, doesn't work. This new fugitive slave law is really going to anger many Northerners, and we're going to see how in a second. So the other part is, like I said, the other part of the compromise is this stronger fugitive slave law. The important parts of it are that it made it a crime to help runaway slaves and allowed officials to arrest those slaves in free areas. So prior to this compromise, runaway slaves could make their way to the North and be free and safe-ish in the North. Slave catchers would travel to the North, but they really didn't have courts to support them. They didn't have police officers to support them, and anyone that caught them trying to take a former slave back to the South would have taken and tried to stop them, because it was not a law that was enforced in the northern states. However, when this fugitive slave law comes around, they have now made this a national law where no matter what, even if you are in a state in the North, slave catchers and those that are hired to catch runaway slaves can now take and come into the North and catch them. And it's also a crime to help runaway slaves, and it allows officials to arrest those slaves in free areas. So not only can they come into those areas, those free states, and arrest runaway slaves, it's a crime to help runaway slaves. So that's the first big part of it. The second big part of it is that slaveholders and slave owners can have witnesses and can have white witnesses. However, runaway African Americans cannot have anyone who has helped them, or they cannot testify themselves. So it really limits the ability of runaway slaves to defend their case, and generally that makes it very easy for slaveholders to prove that that African American is a runaway slave, that they are a slave from their plantation or their farm, and they need to come back and work on that farm. So it makes the job of African Americans proving that they are free much more difficult. And last but not least, something that kind of corrupted the system a little bit, commissioners, or those judges that heard the cases, were given $5 to reject a slaveholder's claim, and they were given $10 to return a fugitive slave to their master. So you have more of an incentive to return a runaway slave, whether they actually ran away or they were born free in the northern states. These judges have more of an incentive to send whatever African American is on trial, sending that person back to the plantation, whether they were part of that plantation or not. So the system and the slave law does a lot to really kind of hurt people more than it does hurt free African Americans and hurt runaway slaves, more than it does really to, for lack of a better phrase, benefit the slaveholders. And really, it's a huge benefit to the slaveholders because they can now move into the free states and bring those slaves back. So it does a lot for them, and it really hurts the African Americans, whether they were born free in the North or ran away. It's not going to matter. They are going to end up back on these plantations or on the plantation for the first time. And as Northerners begin to see this, they get more and more angry about this law. And it causes the abolition movement to move from a radical movement where many Northerners prior to 1850 felt that slavery was a system that happened in the South. It had nothing to do with them. They needed to not worry about it, to now the majority of the North is going to look at abolition and realize this is a movement that they need to support, that is hurting people more than anything else. It is a system that brutalizes people. It is a system that hurts people. It is a system that destroys families and basically kind of breaks the will and the spirit of people. And they see it for that rather than a system of labor. So the Northerners begin to move away from not worrying about what happens in the South, and they move more towards abolition. Abolition becomes a more mainstream movement, a movement that more people in the North support, and the majority of people in the North are going to support instead of just leaving things as they are. So eventually a case is going to kind of put this to the test. And it's going to start in 1846, but eventually it's going to last all the way until 1857, when it finally is able to make its way to the Supreme Court. A African American, a slave by the name of Dred Scott, in the 1830s is brought to northern states, to Wisconsin and Illinois, by his master. They eventually return to Missouri, and Scott's master dies. And Dred Scott was hoping for his master to free him, but instead he wills him. Dred Scott is left to his former master's widow. So his former master's wife is now his new master. So in 1846, Dred Scott argues that because his former master had taken him to Wisconsin and Illinois, that meant he was free. That meant that he could not be held in slavery anymore, according to his view and his kind of argument of the law. Well, eventually, it makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court in 1857, and the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, really tries to take and make a kind of new law and really make the Fugitive Slave Law stronger and really kind of settle the issue of slavery and the disagreement of slavery between the North and the South. And he does that in a couple ways. First, he rules that African Americans, whether they're free or slave, are not considered citizens under the Constitution. And based on that, Dred Scott does not have a right to file a lawsuit in federal court. So no slave can really take and file a lawsuit in federal court, or no free African American, for that matter, can file a lawsuit in federal court under the Dred Scott decision. The second part of this, as to whether he was considered free or a slave, Taney rules that Scott was still considered a slave because he had moved back to Missouri, and the laws in Missouri determined that he was a slave. And the last thing Taney says is he rules the Missouri Compromise restriction on slavery north of the 3630 line unconstitutional because it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to deprive American citizens of property. By not being able to take your property anywhere you want, that is violating your Fifth Amendment rights, according to Taney. So what he is saying is that slaves can be taken anywhere in the United States, and if they are considered a slave, if they are owned as a slave, they are not considered free once they touch free soil. So Congress further kind of makes the point that Congress could not prohibit slave owners from bringing their property where they wanted, what I just said. So what he is doing is he is making it possible for slaves to continue to be stuck in slavery no matter where they're brought in the United States. And the laws of that state, that particular state, does not apply if they are bought as a slave and considered property. So he throws out Dred Scott's case because he says that Dred Scott is not a citizen according to the Constitution, and he further ruled that he's still considered a slave because he moved back to Missouri, and Missouri was his final destination. And what he's trying to do in the first part of this, by saying that African Americans are not citizens, is he's trying to prevent slaves or free African Americans from suing from their freedom, or trying to prevent them from resisting being brought back to the South. And that is something that is going to further anger and further frustrate the people of the North. And that's going to drive them closer to abolition, more towards abolition. And if the position of the North is to free the slaves, obviously the position of the South is going to be to hang on to slavery. And as these two sides drift farther apart, more closely to abolition and more closely to holding on onto slavery, there is no middle ground where these two sides can figure out a compromise to make Southerners and Northerners happy. So what's eventually going to happen is this is going to lead us and help us kind of make our way and kind of harden those ideas to eventually lead us to the Civil War. So the Fugitive Slave Law is going to drive people in the North to abolition, and cases like the Dred Scott case, where African Americans are not seen as citizens in the United States and they're seen as property, and they're, according to the Supreme Court, they are property, that is, and not human beings, that is going to push many Northerners to further agree with abolition and farther away from being able to compromise with the South. So this is going to drive a wedge further between the North and the South. So that is the significance. That is how the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott case are going to lead to the Civil War, and how it's going to lead to this much larger divide. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, guys. So with that said, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Please remember that I will be having a Zoom meeting with you guys from 11 to 12 and from 3 to 4 on Friday. If you do have any questions, if you want to reach out, if you need any help or anything like that. If you have any questions with today's lesson, please reach out to me during my office hours. And with that said, guys, I hope you have yourselves a fantastic day. I'll catch you tomorrow.